We're now on to chapter 4 of C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity. And it's been a steady run-up, and he will say as part of this chapter that we're 100 miles yet from bringing it in line with Christianity. The clue is in the title. What lies behind the law? He begins almost like a précis that what we can say is the law of nature may not be anything except a way of speaking. The so-called laws may not be anything real, but, and I think this is a big but, in the case of man, we saw that this will not be. The law of human nature, or of right and wrong, must be something above and beyond the actual facts of human behaviour.
In the previous chapter, he had set that universal standard of what was right and wrong. And then now what he's doing is he's positing this view that the law can't be attributed solely to natural or to human sources. So it suggests that it points to a higher, more purposeful intelligence. But he doesn't, as you rightly say, jump into the, ha, this is now Christian. He just says this is a higher, more purposeful intelligence.
He talks about it as being mind, but I will get to that shortly. He starts off with giving an overview of materialism, what this universe really is, the materialist view, that matter and space just happen to exist. It just happened by, he calls it a sort of fluke, to produce creatures like ourselves who are able to think. And of course, in his era was becoming a very forceful discussion or talking point, which I would say exploded in the 1990s and became almost predominant in the early 2000s, that there is nothing beyond this universe. And these were the new atheists, weren't they, who were talking about it's just things that we can observe are to do with science and science only.
In terms of sort of natural explanations, I think that the moral law actually sits outside of natural explanations, because natural explanations, instinctive behaviour, they can't be used to describe what the moral law is. They don't explain what the moral law is. And science has got nothing to say about moral law. Science is about observation, repetition of experimentation, and seeing what happens. Science does not answer the philosophical questions that are posed in what would sit behind the moral law.
Yeah. He does talk about that, doesn't he?
Yeah, so, that natural explanations, he kicks it off by sort of rejecting it, saying, it doesn't cut it. A natural explanation doesn't cut it, whatever that natural explanation may be.
Because he says that science observes.
Yes.
It's something of a different kind. This is not a scientific question to ask, is there God? There is no scientific instrument or even theory that can either deny or prove the existence of God.
Absolutely. The question around God is a metaphysical and philosophical and theological question. It's got to be answered with different tools, not scientific tools. When you try and say, well, science says there is no God, well, no, scientism may say there is no God, but scientism is very different from science.
Yeah.
And I think that that's one of the things that sort of tickles me. Brian Cox, who's that British professor who does a lot of these things on TV, he was asked this, about science disproving God. And he says science has got nothing to say about God. It's about examination and repetition of experimentation and all of this and observing what's going on. It doesn't answer those questions. He said, I may not believe in God, but I don't believe in God, not because of science, but because of my philosophical, my theological viewpoint of the world. So you've got to use the right tool to undermine God, and science isn't it.
But I wonder why so many people who go to school and are taught science then make quite a large leap into saying, therefore, no God.
Oh, I know. That's because we are told that science answers everything, that the science is established and set, and the science is there. Well, no, it isn't. And science is never there, because science is all about investigating further. And this is something that in our own lifetime I have seen. When we were born, when we were growing up, when we were going through secondary school, we didn't know anything about DNA. And the single cell was just a single cell on a bit of paper. You draw it like an egg, a fried egg, with the single cell in the centre, and it was a simple cell, they used to call it. Well, the simple cell now transpires to be not quite as simple as we first thought. And that's within our lifetime, Mark, within sort of 40 years of schooling. Science is moving on all the time, and we are learning different things. I read something yesterday about how scientists have divided up some of these subatomic particles and then distanced them, and they all do the same thing in the same way at the same time, even though they're no longer connected.
And they could be separated by hundreds of thousands of miles.
Yeah. So, we're learning stuff all the time. So the science is not set. The science is never settled. And so when you hear this crap from politicians saying the science is settled, it's BS.
And I can't speak for C.S. Lewis, but I don't get the feeling that he's dissing science. It's very useful, extremely useful, and we should protect it and care for all the endeavour that scientists do if it's on a positive note.
I would 100% agree with that. I don't think that he's dissing science in the slightest, and nor am I dissing science. Science is an amazing discipline. Yeah. Scientific minds are incredible, but it is a discipline. It is one stream of looking at things. It is very observational. And it is not there and meant to be there to answer the philosophical questions of life.
And of course, we could also switch it over here, because in the moment we're going to be talking about God as mind and then the arguments that he puts forward. But I think it's also useful to state that whereas if you believe in God, you may defend the belief in God and say science can not prove certain things, but it's useful, it would be useful if a lot of Christians did the same to science. There seems to have got this two fighters in a ring, and they're in separate corners and they don't want to meet, and if they do, it's to fight.
Well, again, this is the combative approach that we have of having to be right and having to have all the answers. And I think that we should be willing to live with mystery and to live with a certain tension as well. We did that piece on Genesis, and we looked at the way that Scripture talks about the creation of the earth. And does it follow a scientific understanding of the world? Probably not, but it wasn't trying to. That's not what its gig was. Its gig was to present an unravelling and unveiling of this creator God. It's not a scientific document. It may touch into some of that.
But it's also, you said a profound thing. If you lived at the time that Moses was putting down the ideas of the first 5 books, and you said that if he had a vision of a jet fighter, how would he describe that? Well, it's very similar to ourselves in the late 19th century when we didn't know what DNA was, but we had some kind of a theory. So you're using language that it turns out not necessarily to be the case. But does that then negate and devalue everything that was said leading up to that moment?
No, of course
in
not.
Science? They don't do that, do they?
No.
But they'll diss language from thousands of years ago to do with faith.
One of the key things is when we look at science and when we look at any investigation like this, we should keep a humble mindset regarding all of this.
Yes.
And recognise that we are not quite as flippin' smart as we think we are.
So let's carry on with C.S. Lewis. So he's effectively given the materialist view in very succinct words. And then he introduces the other view, the religious view. According to it, what is behind the universe is more like a mind. He doesn't, or certainly at this point, delve into what the mind could be and how it links with potentially our own concept of mind. But I get what he is saying is, and of course, mind likes to order. So in effect, he's loading perhaps a lot onto one word here. But I do appreciate the fact that he talks it like a mind, because it is conscious and it has purpose, he says, and prefers one thing to another. And on this view, it made the universe partly for purposes we do not understand. So this is a mind that's not like our mind.
Absolutely, not like our mind at all. And I found that quite interesting. I've read this book before a number of times now, and I just didn't pick up on this concept of mind that he's laid out here, which is strange because I have studied some years ago some of the writings of William Lane Craig, who's a Christian apologetic, and he has this concept about the unembodied mind being God. And he's presented his argument like that for this unembodied mind, and he backs it and he spins it all off something called the Kalam cosmological argument, K-A-L-A-M, Kalam cosmological argument. And it's almost in defense of something that Richard Dawkins said. Richard Dawkins said, if there is a creator God, he must be so complex. He must be so complex because when you look at the complexity of the human machine, the one that created it must be even more complex. And William Lane Craig sort of pushes that to the side and says, well, why? A mind itself is not complex. The thoughts of a mind and what a mind produces are complex, but a mind itself is not complex. I think that William Lane Craig is onto something. So when the Bible refers to God as we would in the Christian understanding, we have God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit, and altogether they make up the mystery of the one united Godhead. God the Father is spirit. And what do we mean by spirit? What is spirit? And I think that there is some sort of crossover with what we mean by spirit and what could be an unembodied mind. I think it's touching into something there, which is really relevant from a philosophical and theological perspective, is incredibly relevant.
The key, however, is what he says next. He revisits the idea that science can't tell us this concept of mind. It's not designed for that. If there is something behind the universe, then either it will have to remain altogether unknown to men, or else make itself known in some different way. And that's the age-old issue, isn't it, between deism, theism, and all the other different isms you can talk about. How could you know God? Can God be known? And could everything about God be known? And how much do you need to know to accept that there is a God, and so on?
And again, I find this a fascinating concept when I apply it to the Christian faith, because the Christian faith says there is this incredible creator God who kicked everything off at the beginning, because this mind is immaterial, is spatially unextended, is unchanging, could exist timelessly, has no beginning, whatever we want to call it, this great spirit, this mind. How does that great spirit mind become knowable to its creatures? Well, the only way it can become knowable to its creatures is to become one of its creatures. And so within the Christian belief, you then have the self-emptying, the kenosis of this great mind, and putting on humanity and putting his toes in the sand in the person of Yeshua, Jesus. Therefore, that God can then become knowable in a way that we can understand.
Slightly off topic then, but it's an interesting point, or even stupid. Was God known then before Jesus?
I think that Jesus has always been God, and God has always been Jesus, and there has always been this timelessness in this concept, which is the mystery of the Godhead. This is not something that we can understand. I mean, Jesus was there at the beginning of creation. Jesus was the mechanism through which creation happened, according to Scripture. So you go, oh, that makes my head ache. How does that work? Well, it makes your head ache. As the rabbis say, accept the mystery. There is a mystery in this. But in the Christian belief, and obviously, how can you know this unknowable source, spirit, being, mind? Well, you can't, unless that source, being, spirit, mind presents itself, himself, to you in a way which you can.
And that is logically sound. And it's also found elsewhere.
Yeah.
Interestingly, and I don't know if I'm going to make sense here. So when you go out and you are walking down the aisle in the shopping mall, you often sense somebody close behind you, but you don't see them. If you're out in the wild, you can tell if the storm is coming in. There are things that even if you're blind, you'll know that something's on its way. You can sense it. And then you'll get people who say, there is no God, but we sense that there is something like gravity. And we sense that there is a thing that brings together the atoms to form us and DNA, but they're not physical. A lot of these things, these concepts of what happens, isn't physical, but they'll stop there and they'll say it can't be observed. But it's like time. How can time be observed in space? If it's a localized thing on Earth, that's fine. But then why are you assuming that there are other things that you cannot grasp by observation, but you can sense certain things? I mean, I remember a doctor, I went to see him, and it was that era where jokingly we said, oh, you may have to get Sauron's finger, prostate, and whatever. And I was talking, it was actually a lady doctor, and she said, in her experience, people who come to see it know when something's not right, but they've got no physical scientific evidence. So I don't get why science automatically, arbitrarily stop at certain things but continue on with others.
Yeah, I think because a lot of the time when you start to dip your toes into the sea of Christendom, for example, depending on how far you shove your toe in, it can get quite uncomfortable for you. People don't like to be uncomfortable, and people don't like to think that there is something that they are answerable to, because we are proud. So there's ego within us that rears its little head up when it's, I'm not being subservient to anything. We need to have a little bit of humility in lots of things.
That's why off air I introduced, or you know about the book already, The Dark Night of the Soul, because he talks about that, St. John of the Cross. That'll be another great book to look at. Okay, so he's talking about God is not necessarily because of a scientific question. But there are questions that we can ask ourselves. Why is there a universe? Why does it go on as it does? Has it any meaning? Science doesn't give a meaning for anything.
It's not there to do that. No.
So there has to be another way, another route in which you then start asking those questions.
Which is part of your background, right? Philosophy.
Yes.
Philosophical conversations and positing questions and trying to unravel and unlock stuff. That's what you do when you wrestle with the why question.
You've said a great thing there, unlock. We unlock ourselves. He actually talks about that. He said there is one thing and only one in the whole universe which we know more about than we could learn from external observation. And that one thing is man. We do not merely observe men, we are men and women, Reg. In this case, we have, so to speak, inside information. We are in the know. You could spend hours talking about then why don't some people accept that? But I guess that we're saying we do. And then he said, and because of that, we know that men find themselves under a moral law, which they did not make, and cannot quite forget, even when they try, and which they know they ought to obey.
Absolutely. And if we are all honest with ourselves, and we actually do examine ourselves, which is the one thing that we can truly examine, because we do have that inside information, we all know that's true. We all know that's true. I know that's true in my life. I know that it's true in your life. I'm convinced it's true in your life because I understand what it does for me, and I understand the way it works. And while I may not have great insight into all of the differences and the minute detail of your life, I know how you work as a human being. And so I think he goes on, doesn't he? He draws that sort of analogy with the mailman delivering letters, and you see the mailman delivering an envelope through the door, and you know that it's a bit of mail, you know that it's a letter. Yeah. And you go, how do you know that? You haven't seen what's in it. And you go, yeah, but I can know that looking at a mailman that he's dropping mail through the box because he does it in my life. And when the mailman does that, I've got a letter, I've got an envelope, I've got something there. And I find that it usually contains a letter.
Yeah.
Humanity, is not so different in terms of what humanity is made up of. There are obviously some outliers in humanity who are very strange, but the vast majority of human beings are very predictable in terms of what makes them tick, what they want, what their desires are, what fires them up, what calms them down. The vast majority of people. And I have had years of experience of seeing that. Even bad men and bad women, you can find an equilibrium with them somewhere.
He develops some really interesting points here for myself. He says, notice the following point, which is kind of what we talked about earlier. Anyone studying man from the outside, as we study electricity or cabbages, not knowing our language and consequently not able to get any inside knowledge from us, but merely observing what we did, would never get the slightest evidence that we had this moral law. For his observations would only show what we did. The moral law is about what we ought to do.
That's right. And so often our lives do not align with what we ought to do. And again, we also know this to be a truism in our own lives. There are many things that I knew I ought to do, and what I acted out was not what I ought to do. Because the moral law is about what I ought to do. That's what it underpins. It doesn't determine my actions, it doesn't determine what I did, but it gives me a marker as to what I ought.
So we need to go inward to observe. And he talks about the fact that if there is a controlling power outside of the universe, it could not show itself to us as one of the facts inside the universe, no more than the architect of a house could actually be a wall or staircase or fireplace in that house. The only way in which we could expect to show itself would be inside ourselves, as an influence or a command trying to get us to behave in a certain way.
And he then goes on and says, and that is just what we do find.
Yes.
Inside ourselves, doesn't he? That is just what we do find. He's onto something here. There's nothing that he said so far that forces you into a Christian position to start with. That. All he's doing is he's encouraging you to just open up your thinking. And that's not a bad thing.
It's not bad. It's a brilliant thing. I'm intrigued also by his use of nomenclature. He says it's like a director, a guide. I'm trying to think How many people see God like a director or a guide?
Yeah, I wouldn't know. I think most people think of God as some sort of harsh judge who sits there smashing people over the head and sending them to hellfire and fury.
Yes.
I think that's how many people view God. I'm not sure if that's the way God should be viewed. Don't get me wrong, I think that there is something called the wrath of God, but how that plays out, I would hate to put a flipping marker on.
It's a shame. I think that they're a very easy bridge for people to cross over.
Yeah, they are.
To begin with, if they doubt the existence of God.
And this is where we have lost a lot of our common sense regarding what Christianity is about. And we have been taken in by the isms and schisms of scientism to start with. Rationalistic, materialistic, enlightened world that we live, where we've jettisoned the belief in any deity. We have been very foolish to do so.
At that point, he really comes to an end in this chapter. There is a little bit that in this version he talks about life force philosophy or creative evolution. It's quite scathing at the end. It says the life force is a sort of tame god. You can switch it on when you want, but it will not bother you. All the thrills of religion are none of the cost. Is the life force the greatest achievement of wishful thinking the world has yet seen? And he names people, doesn't he? I think is he say Bertrand Russell?
Bertrand Russell, yeah.
And Bernard Shaw.
And Bernard Shaw, yeah. Remember what the era that he was writing in as well around that time. There was a big debate, wasn't there, between sort of moral absolutism and moral relativism, which was highly prominent. You had these philosophers such as A.J. Ayer, Bertrand Russell, who were very influential figures at the time, who were actually challenging what has always been the traditional moral framework that the British society grew up in for hundreds, if not 1,000 years. And so Lewis's comments and his argumentation have got to be posited against that contextual setting that he was writing. You know, he's actually setting a response to this rising tide of moral relativism. He's defending the idea of an objective moral truth grounded in a divine source. And I think that's really important. He's not as yet saying, and this is why I'm a Christian. He is just defending that there is objective moral truth and there is a divine source in a culture that is becoming more and more relativistic and has jettisoned the belief in any deity of any description. So he's behind enemy lines doing this.
That's right.
Do you know
I
what I mean?
do. And I personally, of all the chapters we've covered so far, this is the one that I really appreciate the most, because he edges up to something that it really fascinates myself. You just talked about all the isms and all the belief structures, very rigid philosophical boxes that a lot of them are just word games. It's just dealing with verbs and nouns.
Yeah.
And it's like genre in postmodernism. That means you can't step out of it. If you want to make a film that's to do with the Wild West, you can't have certain things, you must include certain things. But what he was talking about in the chapter is this inner knowing. You can sense it. I think personally, when it starts coming to that point about talking about the existence of God, I start to pay attention more. We're getting out from the Haynes manual, so to speak, of this is that, like that, and that. And I really do appreciate what he says about we know, but we can't physically say it in scientific terms.
But we know that we know that we know. That will be the biggest shock to all of us one day, because we've always known.
Would you like to expand on that?
One day each of us will pass away, and it will be at that moment that what we have always known will be revealed in a way, and we will always have known it, and we'll have either done something about it or we won't.
That's the end of the fourth part of the first book. What's coming up next?
No, we haven't got chapter 5.
No, yes, it's 5. We have cause to be uneasy.
And then we get into book 2.
Yeah. Cool. Great stuff.
Nice one.
Ta-ta for now.
Take care, fella.